Aloha and welcome to Condo Insider, Hawaii's show about association living. You know, associations, although private entities, have meetings. They have board meetings, annual meetings, special meetings, committee meetings. And under statute for most condo associations, they're governed by Robert's Rules of Order. And if you haven't seen Robert's Rules of Order, it's 702 pages long. And there is a short version, which is about 200 pages long. And then there's actually a version written in the Native Hawaiian language. Today we're very blessed to have with us Steve Glanstein, a professional registered parliamentarian. Steve is like a doctorate degree in parliamentary procedure. That's what a PRP is, a professional registered parliamentarian. And we're going to talk about some of the basics of association meetings and hopefully have some good discussion on how to run a good association meeting. So I'd like to welcome Steve Glanstein to our show. Thank you for coming today, Steve.
Thank you very much.
Please to tell me, who is Henry Roberts and Robert's Rules of Order? I mean, 702 pages to run a meeting?
Yes, 702 pages, an excellent cure for insomnia. And it's got a lot of sections in it, a lot of information. Henry Robert was an engineer, the Corps of Engineers. He was involved with building bridges in the Northwest as well as in Texas. And he did the seawall in Galveston. And he's been very well known for many of those achievements. However, the thing that has really gotten everyone's attention is he went to a meeting once, and this meeting was to talk about fortifying the city from the Confederacy, and he actually had to conduct a meeting. So he said several prayers. He was a religious man, and after he did that meeting, he determined that he was going to know a lot more about parliamentary procedure. He then continued on to study it throughout the country. He found it different in different places, and he put together his first book in 1876. And immediately sold out within a couple months. He got all sorts of letters. Then he started updating the book, came out with Robert's Rules of Order Revised, and he came out with Parliamentary Law, another big book, and Parliamentary Practice, and then passed away in the early 20th century, and the book has been continued by the Robert's Rules Foundation. We're currently on the 11th edition, which was just printed in 2011.
Now, when they make changes to Robert's Rules of Order, is there a body that does that and recommends it, or how does that happen?
Yes, it's the Robert's Rules Association. There's a group of people who get together in this bar in Baltimore, and they work together, and they have made the changes for several years in Robert's Rules of Order, newly revised, and they're on the authorship team.
And how did that tie into the National Association of Parliamentarians?
Well, the National Association of Parliamentarians started in 1930, and they addressed Roberts and they accepted Roberts, and they started getting involved with training people to conduct meetings, and they provide certification. And they've accepted the latest edition of Robert's Rules of Order, newly revised, as their parliamentary authority, and their training is based upon expertise in that publication.
And a professional registered parliamentarian, a PRP, is the highest level. It's like the doctorate degree in parliamentarians, if I'm correct. What did you have to go through to get that?
Okay, what I had to go through was first a main membership exam, a basic exam to become a regular member of the National Association of Parliamentarians. Regular membership is just one exam. To become registered is the next level up. It's an exam in 5 parts, and it's time to find statements in Roberts and to look things up in that respect. That's the registration level. In the professional registered level, you have to pass a 2-day course in order to do it. And that gives you the professional registered parliamentarian level.
Is there actually an oral question exam in that part of it where people make you go through maybe an exercise orally to pass that part of it?
Yes, in the exam for professional registration, it's a 2-day class exam. You not only have to demonstrate proficiency in presiding, but demonstrate proficiency as a parliamentarian. You also have to demonstrate teaching. They have you teach 5 minutes out of a 1-hour seminar, and they want to see expertise demonstrated in those areas.
Well, you know, we always think of this in the association world. But do you do meetings other than associations? I mean, is there a need for parliamentarians, other types of meetings?
Yes, I've done meetings for churches, straight churches, gay churches. I've done meetings for various organizations like unions. I've done meetings for profit corporations, nonprofit corporations, several different types of meetings. Sometimes we're involved in just organizing board meetings of profit organizations just to get them started to use proper procedure.
I'm afraid to ask this question in a way, but we have the big Democratic and Republican national conventions coming up. Is it feasible they would have a parliamentarian there?
Yes, it would be. They would have a colleague of mine. Normally, they have a colleague of mine who's one of the authorship team there, and he would be assisted by somebody. But yes, they will traditionally have a parliamentarian. The parliamentarian will help draft up the rules as well as the script for whoever's chairing it.
Yeah, I'm afraid to say it, but I think they might drink a lot this year. It seems like it's going to be a challenging year.
I'm sure
in
they've
the
started.
convention world, you know.
I'm sure they started drinking already.
Well, let's talk about one of the basics of association management, a board meeting. Are they governed by Robert's rules? And is there, you know, it seems to me a board is typically 5-9 members. It's a very small group. And Robert's rules is very, you know, very strict and very procedural. How does that work for small meetings?
Well, for small boards and committees, the rules are greatly relaxed. Small boards being about 12 members or less who are present. And so what happens is they don't need a second on motions. The president can not just preside, but can debate and vote. Traditionally, the president doesn't do that, but with small boards or committees, the president can even be one of the most active participants. Also, with small boards, there's no limit on the number of speeches. So if there's a motion come up, the parliamentary limit on a debatable motion is 2 speeches, not more than 10 minutes per speech. With a small board or committee, there's no limit on the number of speeches. Even though a board has the option to limit it if they wish, it's much more flexible.
So the president can actually make a motion then?
That's correct.
Now, I know under annual meetings, we're very precise in getting the exact language in a motion. Oftentimes, boards will sit around the room and say, are we all in agreement we're going to hire ABC company to do the roof for $20,000? Is that adequate for them, and then they just record it in the minutes, or do they have to have a more formal written motion at that time?
No, they don't really need that level of formality. Where the formality is to make sure that the minutes accurately reflect the decision that was made. So in this case, the language can be, if there's no objection, we will hire this company at this particular cost. Since there's no objection, the motion's adopted, and we have approved hiring this company at this particular cost. And the minutes would show they agreed by unanimous consent to hire that company.
And you kind of led into the minutes issue. You know, let's talk about minutes very. To me, I think that's a very important document for an association. You know, it's got a lot of legal ramifications down the road. What are your comments about minutes?
Minutes have come a long way in Hawaii in the last 30 years in my practice. Minutes are supposed to be the official actions, not who said what, how they said it. It's very different than being a state board or commission. Minutes of condominium associations, community associations, they're under Robert's Rules of Order newly revised, so they reflect the specific actions that were approved or disapproved. They don't reflect somebody's opinion. They're not supposed to reflect a lot of what was said. That's what minutes are. And over the years, as minutes have followed that model more and more, there have been less controversy in Hawaii as a result of those minutes.
Well, I can understand that because they're not a newsletter, first of all. They're, as you said, they're the actions taken. And I think it's very hard, people who write minutes, to really accurately describe what a third or fourth party said. And that's why you limit it to the motions and the vote on those motions, because it becomes very controversial. Then if you didn't quite say it, then the guy wants to amend the minute, or the guy or the girl saying, no, I really meant it this way. It becomes much more than the official record of the association if you allow too much into the minutes.
Yeah, that's correct. And so what we're careful with our association clients is to advise them to make sure their minutes not just comply with the law, but that they comply with proper procedures. Roberts is dictated by state law. And most of our clients have been very good that way.
So we have a motion at a board meeting. We're right now talking primarily board meetings. Does that have to be seconded on a board?
If it's a small board or committee, no.
So if you have a single person on a 5-member board, say I move to paint the building pink, are they obligated then to have a vote or a consensus on it because no seconds required?
They're obligated, if it's a valid motion to paint the building pink, then they're obligated to consider it for debate as well as for decision.
Yeah, unless someone withdrew the motion, I guess.
Unless it's withdrawn, or perhaps somebody moves to postpone it indefinitely, which is a motion to kill it without a direct vote. Or perhaps if it violates the bylaws. For example, if the building is supposed to be white and the bylaws say to change the color of the building, it requires owner's approval, then the chair would be able to rule that motion out of order because it would violate a specific section of the bylaws.
So when you're writing those minutes, for example, and you now have the vote where of the 5 board members, 4 voted in favor and 1 voted opposed, do those people's names get recorded in the minutes? Do the minutes require the person how they voted to be included in the minutes.
Yeah. If it's a board meeting, that's not an executive session, a regular board meeting in the condominium world, the minutes require that the votes of the directors be in the minutes.
So then the vote, the minutes would say, voted in favor, John, Ted, Susie, and Mary, and voted opposed,
Jack.
whatever it may be.
Correct,
So-
they would have that, yes.
And you did bring up executive sessions, which is, under the law, the boards can go into an executive session to discuss legal and personnel matters.
Yep.
And I think also when they adjourn from an executive session, they have to report to the assembly what they did in general terms. Correct?
Well, not necessarily. For example, if a board goes into executive session and they agree to settle a case for not more than X number of dollars, there's no way they're going to adjourn into regular session and then announce, oh yeah, we agreed to settle the case for not more than X number
Right.
of dollars. That's going to stay very secret until after the settlement is all signed and sealed. So the board doesn't necessarily have to return and provide that information. However, some things they do. For example, if they agree to give a Christmas bonus to everybody, and they come out of executive session, they have to have a mechanism to allow management to know that they've agreed to give a Christmas bonus. So usually in the motion to approve the Christmas bonus, they would provide that the president has authorization to contact management to let them know the Christmas bonus has been approved.
Now, do you keep minutes in executive session? I mean, it's separate from the regular session for privilege reasons, but should a board keep minutes in an executive session?
Absolutely. There's no authority to hide the executive session, so there's no official record of it. What the board has to recognize is the awesome responsibility they have to keep those minutes confidential. That means you just don't email them to the world. That means if anything, you have one person putting them together, okay, and then they go through them, review them at another executive session meeting, hand them back, keep them sealed in an envelope someplace, and maybe it goes to their attorney's office if there's litigation, but they make sure it's kept very separate.
I know it's a legal question, but do you know offhand if there was litigation and they subpoenaed the minutes from an executive session, do they get turned over to, or are they still considered privileged?
Well, privilege is a legal question. I know that sometimes it'll go to their attorney's office, so if there is a subpoena, they're going to fight it because it may have decisions they've made with their counsel. So I do know that has happened.
But it is possible that some executive session minutes may have to turn over and resolve a litigation.
It certainly is possible.
And what's your number one suggestion on minutes?
Minutes need to be the official actions of the organization. Do not put somebody's personality or personal information in the minutes. Don't put your opinion in. Keep it the official action. Remember, those minutes can be seen by prospective buyers. They can be seen by all sorts of people. So make those minutes clean. If you have to take separate notes, if there's issues and items that you need to discuss as a board member later, make it on a separate document. Don't call it the official association or board minutes.
And what do you say to the owners who say the minutes don't contain enough? You know, they really want it more of a newsletter, the way I look at it. What do you say to those owners about why the minutes are somewhat Spartan in nature, only recording the decisions?
Okay, there's 4 words for that. Go to the meeting. Board meetings in Hawaii and condominium board meetings are generally open to the owners. They can go, they have some rights to participate. If it's that important, go to the meeting. Have somebody who's another owner go to the meeting and relay to you what happened. Consider as a board having a newsletter. Doesn't constitute the official actions, but does provide a little bit of information.
So getting ready to go into the next and more detailed part, the annual meeting or the special meeting of the owners, let me set the stage by asking you a couple of quick questions. What is the longest annual meeting you've ever attended of a condo association?
Well, Richard, you were there. We had a weekend together, and they called a meeting. It was a weekend meeting, and they hired a bunch of experts regarding reconstruction who had less than a week's worth of notice. They came in from all over the country to describe what they could do for reconstruction, and that was the longest one. It was a weekend. I'm not sure if it was a special meeting or an annual meeting, but it went for 2 days on Neighbor Island.
And how much did that cost?
That cost over $70,000.
Wow.
So, very expensive.
How about the shortest meeting you ever had?
The shortest meeting that I was at, or the shortest meeting that I know of. The shortest meeting I was at was about 8 minutes and 15 seconds. My daughter beat me with 8 minutes this year at the shortest meeting, annual meeting. Elections, tax resolution, all done in 8 minutes.
Well, that's going to get us started for part 2, but we're going to take a short break and be back with Steve Glanstein in just a minute.
Aloha, how you doing? I'm Gordo the Tech Czar, here on Think Tech Hawaii, where we co-host Hibachi Talk, where we talk about technology and bring in all kinds of cool guests. Also, my co-host with me today is
Andrew the security guy. Thanks for watching. Thanks for watching Think Tech Hawaii, and thanks for watching Hibachi Talk. We also have Angus.
And you there, lad. It's Angus. I bring in all kinds of wee things. Oh, look, you can see my lips moving.
Aloha, I'm Kaui Lucas, host of Hawaii is My Mainland, here on Think Tech Hawaii every Friday at 3 p.m. We address issues of importance for those of us who live here on the most isolated landmass on the planet. Please come join me Fridays at 3 p.m. Mahalo.
Aloha and welcome back to Condo Insider. We're chatting with Steve Glanstein, professional registered parliamentarian, about running successful meetings for associations in Hawaii. And the first part of the show, we talked about board meetings, and the most interesting part about that is that boards of less than 12 people have much more relaxed rules. They don't have to go through quite the formality of the motions and the limit of debate. Presidents can vote, presidents can participate in the meeting, making it much easier for a small board to conduct its business. Then we were talking briefly about minutes, that the only thing that should appear in the minutes for legal reasons and other reasons are the official actions taken by the board. It's very difficult to write what third parties are saying or not saying, and so this is official actions of the board. And we were starting going into the annual meeting, and I'm going to again go back, and we were just talking about 2 meetings he had. The longest was several days at the cost of $70,000 for a condo association. And yes, I was present for that meeting, so I remember I still have the headache from that meeting. But anyway, that was the longest, and the shortest was, he said, about 8 minutes, because they had very little business to conduct and whatever it may be. So I want to lead in, what is the strangest meeting you've ever had?
I've had a lot of strange meetings. It's difficult to say what the strangest one is. I've had removals. I've seen policemen come and arrest people and take them out of the meeting. Then the meeting gets very peaceful. I've had a meeting a few weeks ago where a guy tried to jump over the desk after the meeting. He was upset at the president. So it's difficult to say what the strangest meeting is. They're all different. No 2 meetings are the same. So it's very difficult to identify the strangest. Some of them are just stranger than others.
You seem to remind me of a 16-unit project we both know of, where we had, I think, 4 lawyers and 2 police officers run a meeting of 16 units, of which there's only 9 owners because of multiple ownership. To me, that would be probably one of the stranger ones I've attended, you know.
Yeah, I've seen that. We've had video cameras running because of the behavior of one individual on a board. And by having the video cameras running, she actually acted very rational and very reasonable. We've had another one where a guy took a swing at me at the meeting, and the nickname of the association was the Abu Ghraib Community Association. That's what it's now been called. So the meetings, it really does vary. People get passionate about their homes, sometimes a little too passionate.
Well, before we go into some of the specifics of annual meetings, let's just talk about, because obviously nobody wants to have conflict and fights and anger, but as you said, people are very passionate about their homes, and they take it very personal sometimes. Do you have any general advice going into a meeting, both for the board and for the owners, about how to take a deep breath and address this issue so a meeting can be conducted according to its documents in a democratic fashion, for lack of a better word?
You're referring to annual meetings, I take it?
Yes, I am.
For annual meetings, the board needs to have a certain level of transparency that's consistent with their owners as well as their obligation to take care of the association. They need that well before the annual meeting. That has to exist. Owners have to feel like they're a part of this process. The second component on that is that owners have to recognize that the annual meeting is a business meeting. It's there to basically get a few things done. Minutes, tax resolution, election, maybe some other approval motions, and that's it. We have created the owners forum, in order to allow for issues that people really need to bring out for the new board that comes after the business meeting. And by identifying business versus non-business, we've been able to have meetings much more peaceful.
So when you talked about the forum, the way I understand that to be is that the business meeting is conducted and adjourned. Then they go into the forum and they can talk about all the issues they're concerned about affecting the association. But in that case, then that forum does not appear in the minutes. Is that correct?
That's correct. The forum is not, it's much more informal. It allows people to be a little bit more free about what they want. We can't fix the past, folks. We can't fix the past, but let's get a list of what we want the board to do going forward. I'll usually instruct management to take some notes on that, but that's not official association action. It's getting information, allowing for some transparency to get this information, communication, get it communicated to the board as well as management.
So I can't think of any governing document that I've seen where there isn't a requirement for an annual meeting. And I think state law requires one meeting annually as well. Is that how you understand that?
In Hawaii, yes. There are some groups that may have biennial meetings or biennial conventions that constitutes their meetings. But here, there's usually an annual meeting every year.
And so when the board is sitting down with its management company, or if it's self-managed, planning the annual meeting and determining what is called the order of business, how do they determine that? I mean, is there a process or mandatory things, or where does the order of business come from?
Well, the order of business comes from Roberts. There's a general sequence in the order of business. Many associations have it identified in their bylaws. Right after the sections on annual meetings, they might have something that says the order of business at all meetings or at all annual meetings shall be. So that's where the order of business comes. It's a rather simple order if you want to expand a little bit on it. The order of business begins after you've called the meeting to order for basically reading and approval of minutes. If the minutes were previously approved, you're just announcing that fact. Reports of officers, boards, maybe standing committees if any exists, any special committees. And if there's unfinished business, that is items that were carried over, or perhaps bylaw amendments, that comes in under unfinished business, followed by new business. New business characteristically would be a tax resolution in order to protect the organization's tax-free status.
So you call the meeting to order and there's no quorum. And you have to have a quorum to approve all these things. And what do you do if you have no quorum?
Well, there's 4 things you can do without a quorum. Okay, you can recess, see if more people show up. You can adjourn and say, we're done, come back next year. You can fix the time for a continuation meeting, which is a motion, fix the time to which to adjourn. Or you can take steps to get a quorum. One way to take steps is people get their cell phones out and they start calling other people. So any one of those 4 things can and have been used.
And the most common one I've seen, which is to adjourn to a date in the future, because our ownership of condos in Hawaii are a lot of absentee owners, living in other states or countries. And so it's often difficult to go find someone in the neighborhood to get the quorum, right? So we see a lot of times that boards will adjourn to a fixed date in the future to give them a chance to get a quorum. And so the question is that's a proper procedure, number one, and do the original proxies, do they have to start all over again, or do the original notice and the original proxies count for that adjourned meeting in the future?
Generally, in my experience, the proxies do have that provision where they say they're valid for this meeting and its adjournments, which would mean that if they properly continue that meeting, they have to properly continue it to another time, date, and place. That will keep those proxies alive. If they don't, then they may end up having to start all over again.
So when that is found out, when they call the meeting to order, being very specific, and the chair sees I don't have the quorum and I want to fix it to, let's say, a month from now, and let's say the proxies allow for that. In that particular case, is that a vote of the assembly or is that the chair's prerogative?
That's a vote of the assembly. The chair can propose it for the assembly's unanimous approval, but it's the assembly that's deciding where to continue it, when to continue it.
That would be a majority of those present by person and proxy at that moment in time.
Usually, it depends on their bylaws, but that's usually what the result is.
So if you only had 40% there, for example, in person and by proxy, and assuming that's voting percentage, not quorum only, that majority of that pool of percentage of common interest would get to determine whether to adjourn it to a date in the future or not.
Usually, you have to look at your bylaws, because if it says a majority present, you have to include the quorum only as well. So if the quorum only and the voting percentages say 40%, And more than 20% is needed in order to continue that meeting to another time, date, or place.
Okay, so on a very complex project, the annual meeting, we've gotten through calling it the order, we've determined we have a quorum, and we know we have an order of business because it's in Roberts and in most cases our local bylaws. And we get to the reports section next. And what type of reports are there? Who gives them? Can you take questions? How does that work?
Okay, the reports are several categories. First is reports of officers. And that is the officers listed in the bylaws in the order that they are listed in the bylaws. That's reports of officers. Then report of the board, if there is one. If the board doesn't have a report, many times they don't have a report and they speak through their president. Then if there's any standing committees or special committees. Now, the reports of standing and special committees are not standing and special committees of the board. They're standing and special committees of the entire entity, the entire organization, which are very rare. There might be a standing committee that's a design committee that makes a report. Depends, because it depends on their appointment. But very rare that we have reports like that. Those are the reports.
And a common thing I also see is the auditor report being either approved, and oftentimes it's not available because, I think there's like about 1,700 condo associations in Hawaii, and the meetings are all done for the first quarter, and a lot of times auditors don't have that report ready at that time. But is that a standing report also, the auditor's report? Is that like part of the regular script? Or?
As a matter of practice, the auditor's report is presented as part of or immediately following the treasurer's report. Usually, bylaws provide that the board manages the association, including the financials, so the reports may get presented to the board for formal approval. However, the statute also requires the availability of that report and its presentation to the owners. So if it's available, they will have it at the annual meeting. They'll say something like the auditor's report for the year ending 2015 was available when you checked in. Okay.
Now, the owners, when they accept that report, as usually as there's no objections, the report is adopted, I think is what the script says, something to that effect. They're not really approving the audit, they're just acknowledging receipt. Or are they approving the audit?
Well, it's rare for the owners to have to adopt the report today, because usually, as I said, it's the board that is hiring the auditor. Usually, the board manages the finances for most of the condos that I work with, so then that would mean that the auditor needs to report back to the board. So the owners are not necessarily accepting or approving the report. In some rare cases, when they do adopt it, they are approving that report. So we do look through it to see if there's any allegations of fraud or any type of thing, which they may want to check with their legal guys before they take an official opinion. So it's rare for owners nowadays to approve the auditor's report.
Well, backtracking to a board meeting for a second, looking at where financial statements are reviewed by the board.
Yes.
Are they approving those financials? Are they just filing them subject to audit? I mean, if there's a mistake in them, the board may not have caught it or seen it because they're very complex, right? When going to a board meeting, backtracking for a second, how about the approval of financial statements at a board meeting, or acceptance, or what is the proper lingo, and how does that work?
Okay, that's a very good question. And here's why. Because the financial statements that are not audited, they don't get approved subject to audit. First of all, you're not generally auditing every single monthly financial statement. They just get filed. The board doesn't express an opinion on them, they're just filed. That's the proper procedure with financial statements. Now, if it's a year-end financial, it may get referred to the auditor, but it's the auditor's report that gets approved. So you don't file them subject to audit. Think about the wording. If you file it subject to audit and it gets audited, do you unfile it if it's a bad audit? It doesn't make a lot of sense. So the treasurer's reports are simply filed.
So what would be the proper language? If there's no objections, the September financial statement is filed?
Yep, it's not even no objection. The next item of business is the treasurer's report. The treasurer makes a report. Are there questions on the report? The report is filed. The next item of business is the report of, and just keep moving on.
Okay. So now, the primary reason you have annual meetings is that there's election of directors, typically. And more times than not, they're phased so many every year, so you don't lose them all. And not always true, but you don't lose them all at one time, so you have some continuity of experience on that. Let's talk about the election and proxies and appointment of tellers. How does that process all work?
Well, proxies are basically a power of attorney giving someone the right to vote for somebody else. And that's basically what the proxies are. The appointment of tellers is usually done by the chair. Some bylaws are different, but for the most part, the chair will appoint tellers who will be involved with collecting the ballots, working with management to count the ballots and report the results back to the membership.
They don't have caucuses, I bet, and super delegates.
Well, they actually have what they call caucuses, not among the tellers. The caucus is usually done by a board of directors, because certain proxies may name the board as an entity, and the board may decide to get together during the recess and decide how do they cast those ballots that are given to them based upon a particular proxy.
Well, basically, state law in Hawaii on an association, condo association, requires that the owners be given 4 choices with respect to a proxy. You know, board majority, board equal, individual, or quorum only. Can you just highlight those briefly, what the difference is?
Yeah, well, first of all, the state law does require that if association funds are used for these proxies. And basically, there's 4 of them. The first one would be given to the board to be decided by a majority of those directors who are present at the meeting itself. The second option is to be given to the board of directors to be divided equally among those directors who are at that particular meeting. The third one is to be given to an individual and the individual's name. The fourth one is known as quorum only, which basically, there's nobody called quorum only. It's basically giving it to the association, and it's there only for the purposes of quorum. So it's like having a body that's there, is present for the quorum, but is not allowed to vote on anything. And those are the 4 options with respect to proxies using association funds.
Well, I know that under the statute, those 4 options have to be given when the association solicits proxies. If I'm a homeowner, I'm sitting at home and I want to give someone a proxy, and I take a piece of white paper, and I just write the date, the association, the date and time of the meeting, my unit number, and sign it and say, I give my proxy to Jose. Is that a valid proxy?
Yeah, well, you have to print your name also.
Yes.
So you have to follow the requirements in the statute. But yes, you don't need those boxes if you're doing your own private proxy for a condominium association. However, we must qualify that to say, get legal advice. Make sure you don't miss an essential element, such as printing your name.
Right. So in essence, a homeowner who's on his own and he wants to give someone a proxy and he can't find the proxy, if he put all the relevant information in and signed it, that would be a valid proxy for the secretary to accept for the purposes of that meeting.
For condominiums, for HOAs, there's legislation pending to line them up to provide that same flexibility.
So it may not be true for a homeowner association.
That's correct, but for condominiums, it is true.
Wow, interesting. So now we have another issue under elections. I think it's more rare these days and common. It's something called cumulative voting. Can you describe cumulative voting for us? And I know it has to be present in the bylaws to be, maybe not true, because I think under the nonprofit corporation statute, there might be some exceptions to that. Tell us about cumulative voting.
Okay, cumulative voting, if you're a co-op, it's a little different. We're not really talking much about cooperatives. If you're a profit corporation, it's different with respect to cumulative voting. People can demand it. If you're a nonprofit corporation, if you're a condominium, it's got to be in your bylaws. Cumulative voting is basically a system by which a minority has increased power to elect somebody to a board or to whatever entity is using cumulative voting for the election. It basically means if there's 3 positions open, for example, somebody will get 3 votes based upon those 3 positions. They can take those 3 votes and put them on one person, or put two votes on one on another, or 1 on each of 3. So it allows a minority to accumulate their power in a much larger manner and have a better opportunity to get somebody on the board of directors or entity which has cumulative voting.
I want to spend some more time on that, but we're going to again take a short break. We have Steve Glanstein here, professional registered parliamentarian, talking about the do's and don'ts of annual meetings and other types of meetings. So we'll be right back.
Aloha, this is Reg Baker. I'm the host of Business in Hawaii. We air every Thursday at 2 o'clock on thinktechhawaii.com. We broadcast from the ThinkTech studios in downtown Honolulu, and we talk about positive and successful companies in Hawaii. People that have been successful despite the obstacles. They all have a good story to tell. Hopefully we'll see you on Thursday at 2 o'clock. Aloha.
Aloha, namaskar, and hello. I am Anu Hittel, and I host a show on climate change. It's called Climate Change Beyond Outrage, and in it, we go beyond outrage to look at solutions to global climate problems facing people, nations, and the world. Join me every Tuesday at 1 o'clock Hawaii Standard Time Aloha, namaskar, and goodbye.
Aloha again, and welcome back to Condo Insider. We're talking with Steve Glanstein, professional registered parliamentarian, about association meetings. We've already kind of discussed the do's and don'ts of board meetings, the proper way to do minutes. We're now engaged in annual meetings, and where we left off was we talked about a quorum, and if there is no quorum, that the assembly does have the right to adjourn it to a future date and take other types of action to continue the meeting and thus avoid potentially the cost of more mailings and having to regather the proxies from their first effort. We've talked about the ability of the officers to give reports. We didn't really discuss, Steve, is that a time for questions of the people when they gave the report, or is that not the time?
Well, they can ask questions at the sufferance of the chair. Once those questions become debate, that's where the chair has to stop it. There's two types of questions. There's questions of procedure. Procedural questions, is it in order to make a motion based on this report? That's called a parliamentary inquiry. Another type of question relates to facts. Is it correct that we had a deficit of so much this year? That's called a request for information. Or does the treasurer know what we spent on payroll last year, inclusive of our settlement? That's requests for information. Those can be made. However, it's up to the chair to determine when that gets into debate. And individuals making the reports can't be forced to answer those questions either. So some speakers have said, I'm going to make my report. However, if there's any questions, please bring them up later during the owner's forum. And then they just move on and finish the report.
Yeah, that's been my experience. More times than not, they want to get through the report phase, and what they'll do is they will say to the assembly, please, I'll take questions during the forum. And in this way, you know, owners who come to the meeting and want to get their business done, I hate to use the word held hostage, they're not held hostage through a lot of stuff that one or two people may have on their agenda. You can get them there, have the business done, the voting done, and then people can go on their way, those who don't want to stay for the forum or engage in more detailed discussions on some other reports. And that's been my experience anyway.
Well, in the most extreme case, I had an owner with 30 questions for a treasurer. And then the treasurer tried to answer that, and finally the treasurer said, enough, that's it. I've answered enough, please move on, Mr. Chair. I said, okay, the treasurer is not going to be answering any other questions at this time. The next item of business is the election of directors, and then we just continued on.
Well, on the parliamentary inquiry thing, is the assembly allowed to ask the parliamentarian how to do something? I mean, most people are not going to be skilled in those 700 pages of Robert's Rules of Order. So can they say, by saying parliamentary inquiry, is it in order for me to make a motion to do something, or do they have that ability, or is that taboo?
Well, the membership, rather than the assembly, the membership can make a parliamentary inquiry, but it has to be through the chair. So the membership might say a question for the parliamentarian, they would ask through the chair. The chair decides whether or not to have the parliamentarian answer it. The situation is different when there's no parliamentarian and say I'm acting as a professional presiding officer. That's a different environment. But if I'm the parliamentarian, I don't just answer questions directly from the assembly while the meeting is going on. It usually gets directed through the chair.
And the chair would say, I'm going to ask the parliamentarian to answer that question for you.
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay. What is your personal preference? Do you feel that the chair should allow those questions, or?
Yeah, I think the chair should allow them, but balance them. So that way, as parliamentarian, I don't become a tool of somebody who's trying to embarrass or intimidate a chair. So it's important that the chair basically keep the meeting on track and not let it get, as you said, held hostage by a superfluous number of questions and answers about procedure.
Well, I kind of took us back a little bit because you brought some very interesting questions up. I want to go back now. We were at the election phase, and we were talking about cumulative voting, and just to have you repeat that one more time in short order, short, simple terms, what is cumulative voting?
Cumulative voting is a system whereby a member may stack their votes, voting as many times for as many positions that are available. So instead of voting just once for each of individual, they can vote 3 times for one person if there's 3 positions available to get on a board. So it gives them, it allows them to multiply their voting power for one individual.
To somewhat create some kind of minority interest on the board through them having a large enough minority group that they could, through cumulative voting, elect a person to represent that, quote, minority group.
Well, you say represent that minority group, that's where the problem is. Once you get on a board, you need to represent the entire organization, not the constituency that elected you. And that's some of the debate that rages today on cumulative voting. Because even though that minority may elect a person to get on the board because of the numbers that they have, once that person's on that board, they have the same fiduciary duty as other board members to take care of that entire organization, not just the minority that elected them.
One of the unique things I believe exists in our condo law is that a removal may be made at any regular or special meeting by the owners. And it takes a majority of the entire ownership in most cases and most bylaws, 50.001% to do a removal. What if that person was elected by cumulative voting?
In the condominium world you're referring to, I take it?
Yes, that's correct.
There's a statute 514B 106 subsection F that provides specifically that you can remove with a majority of unit owners. And you have to replace with that same majority of unit owners if the removal is successful. Most legal opinions today are that precludes cumulative voting. It's a majority of unit owners, there's no cumulative voting for it. For the removal, there's no cumulative voting for that replacement. This was litigated on Kauai, and the ruling that came down was there's no cumulative voting for it. The legal impact of that in Hawaii, I don't know, I'm not a lawyer. But basically, the legal opinions that we've gotten are that there's no cumulative voting in the removal or the replacement. And you think about it, can somebody vote 9 times to remove one person from the board? It doesn't make a lot of sense.
That's an interesting point. So let's say you have an annual meeting, you have an election, and a person gets elected by cumulative voting. Is it proper at that same meeting to have another motion to remove them, and where the simple majority of all the ownership could remove them before they ever took office?
Well, it's not a simple majority, it's a majority of the unit owners, and yes, they could, and this has happened.
So people have been elected by cumulative voting, and 2 minutes later, or at some appropriate time in the meeting, someone's making a motion to remove them from the board, even though they were elected by cumulative voting, and therefore a majority of all unit owners then could remove that person.
Yeah, yes, this has happened, and I was involved in testifying on the change to this statute to say that basically when you get to the level of a majority of unit owners, they should be able to decide who is on or is not on their board.
That's really, really interesting. So the last kind of part of the annual meeting is usually some standard resolutions. I would call them a tax rollover resolution. Maybe a requirement to ratify or authorize the board to hire a managing agent or auditor. Can you just briefly comment on that last part? And
The management agent or the tax resolution?
just in general, the other types of resolutions that can be made at a meeting that are typical and more times than not controversial.
There's about 3 or 4 of them. One of them might be the collection of rent from delinquent owners. If tenants of delinquent owners, that may be one that gets approved at an annual meeting. Another one is a requirement that owners have reasonable levels of insurance to protect the entire association in the event of things like leaks and flooding. The third one would be the tax resolution, which is the most common one, which is to help protect the association's tax-free status. That's normally worked out and received from the association's CPA. And finally, the fourth one might be to approve a management contract, even though boards characteristically decide who the managing agent can and should be. There are some older bylaws that still provide that it takes a majority of the owners to approve that particular managing agent's contract.
I know last year there was legislation trying to balance out all those little issues, because in theory on that concept, you have a management agent contract require a majority of all owners, which is 50.1%. You only get 50.1% show up and one person's against it, and it creates all of this administrative cost and expense to again go back and get the management contract ratified.
Yeah, and we see that as a real problem, because you can walk into a meeting with 60% present, and if 20% is quorum only, even if they all said yes, they still don't get to the majority unit owners requirement. And from an organizational standpoint, it's the board that's looking at those contracts. It's the board that's deciding who the managing agent is, and certainly the board should be able to hire and fire them. So from procedurally, as a parliamentarian, I'm stuck with the cards that I got, the bylaws that I have. But hopefully that gets changed in the future and through legislation or amendment of bylaws.
Well, you're all watching Condo Insider, and we're talking with Steve Glanstein, professional registered parliamentarian, about the do's and don'ts of Robert's rules. And I think the overall feeling I've got, we have to treat each other with respect, be transparent, and follow the Robert's rules and your governing documents to make the meeting successful. Next week, we're going to be discussing assistance animals and service animals, and there's quite a bit of difference between the two. And we have an expert to talk about those obligations, because even though you may have no pet rules, we obviously have handicap we have to take care of, and there's a big discrepancy on the service animal and assistance animal. So we'll wait until next Thursday at 3 o'clock to talk about that topic. We want to thank Steve for appearing on Think Tech Hawaii and talking about Robert's Rules, and we look forward to seeing you all next week. Aloha.